art in the most fundamental way.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's a really nice introduction. So I also just wanted to thank Anneliek and Daniel and everyone here for organizing this. And what I'm going to talk about today is actually not looking into the future, but sort of a step back, which is a kind of historical example that I think has a lot of resonance with the many of the issues that we're talking about this weekend. So it looked like smoke and mirrors. The Pepsi Pavilion, as this was called, was a giant dome created for the World's Fair in Osaka, Japan in 1970. And it was shrouded in a kind of all-encompassing fog that was ever shifting. Inside, and this is actually a test dome, but I just want to show you an example. One wandered inside a 90-foot diameter, 210-degree spherical mirror, 10 times larger than any spherical mirror ever built at the time. And the optical effects, which I'll show you in a bit, were really unprecedented. They were reflections that were fully three-dimensional and inverted, sort of hovering in space in front of you. An elaborate programmable electronic control system inside generated complex lights and sounds that took advantage of the equally wild acoustic properties of this dome. Wireless radio handsets inside also allowed visitors to pick up different audio transmissions as they walked around. Kinetic sculptures, lights, lasers, and performances animated the pavilion throughout. Nothing could seem more spectacular. Actually, I'll stay on that for a second. More exemplary of the global expansion of technology and money. This was a large-scale international project that offered a vast arena of sensory experience, but also of communications media, new at the time, blending the physical movement of bodies with kind of a pulsing set of transmissions, computation, and electronic systems. It was immersive, and it went beyond. The title of the pavilion, or the subtitle, was fittingly, quote, "World Without Boundary." But this pavilion wasn't just a simple reflection of the utopian global village, not just another chapter of culture sort of subsumed into technology. And it goes against the usual oppositions we have, I think, between art and technology, between utopian and critical, between simulated and real, between human and machine, that still usually characterize our conversations today. The very making of the pavilion was a collective experiment. More than 75 artists, engineers, and architects worked in collaboration, and you see some of them here on the slope in front of the pavilion, and an engineer and an artist looking very much like an engineer and an artist on the right. They worked with Japanese and American construction firms, executives from Pepsi, and government bureaucrats in Japan. The artist Robert Breer, who you see right here with the colorful scarf, was better known for his experimental animated films and kinetic sculptures, but he happened to live in an upper middle class town in upstate New York, and his neighbor happened to be an executive at Pepsi. Pepsi had already garnered a spot for the pavilion, which you see on the right, at the upcoming Expo 70, and the soft drink empire really wanted to make the most of it. So they didn't know what they were going to do, but they thought, this fair was going to be sort of higher than high tech, with groundbreaking Japanese architects participating. It was the first World's Fair in Asia, and the largest World's Fair ever at that point. It was the first such event in Japan after the war. So needless to say, the kind of violent and horrific near past was sublimated in a display of nationalist, humanist, and techno-utopian pomp. And multinational corporations kind of fit right into this scheme. The president of Pepsi Japan had actually launched the massive and massively successful, quote, Pepsi Generation ad campaign in 1963, essentially inventing youth-oriented lifestyle marketing, which became what we know now as like the new generation, that slogan. And the pavilion was intended to kind of extend this futurist branding. Breer's neighbor, the Pepsi executive, began to think that, quote, for the pavilion, we would be very smart instead of going the gimmicky route, like a rock concert, which they had been thinking of doing, we wanted to do something, quote, genuinely prestigious, to create a piece of contemporary art, one very much in keeping with an avant-garde group, but one also understandable by the people in Japan, end quote. So it's a slightly problematic statement to make. In September 1968, this Pepsi executive asked Verbier, the artist, if he might be interested in participating in this Pepsi Pavilion. Verbier initially said no, but he realized that he might actually just have the perfect solution. He had become involved with a group, and I'm showing you one of the first meetings of this group here, an organization called Experiments in Art and Technology, or E.A.T for short, which had been founded in 1966 by the artists Robert Rauschenberg and Bell Laboratories engineer Billy Kluver, as well as others. And the group wanted to facilitate collaborations between artists and engineers, sponsored largely by industry and at a large scale. So by 1970, E.A.T had no less than 5,000 members around the world, ranging from participants like John Cage and Carolee Schneemann, to sociologists like Daniel Bell, to physicists like Vikram Sarabhai, who is head of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission. Nothing in the history of art matches that kind of scale. And E.A.T, in other words, really formed a kind of extraordinary parallel between art and the rise of big science, that sort of explosion in scale of scientific and technological laboratory research in the mid-20th century. The Pepsi Pavilion was one of the largest single collaborations in post-war art as well. And it was the biggest collaboration that E.A.T ever did. But also, not surprisingly, it was pretty chaotic. The fog was realized by the young Japanese artist Fujiko Nakaya, who, with the engineer Tom Mee, I'll just flip back to the fog, devised a wholly new form, a fog made out of pure water, no chemicals, and it was a kind of enormous atmospheric sculpture that had never been produced before. The idea of a full hemispheric mirror dome was also a product of the group. This group sort of meeting casually. Oh, sorry. I'll just stay on this. And they were all interested in both the optical and acoustical properties of a dome. The actual shape and construction was the outcome of many trials and dead ends and forking paths. So lots of research and testing ensued. So let me just skip. Yeah. A physicist at Caltech, Elsa Garmeyer, led the effort. After exploring a kind of hard construction versus an inflatable structure, the group decided to attempt a full-scale prototype of an inflatable mirrored dome, with materials supplied by a top balloon technology firm and constructed with members of E.A.T's local branches in Los Angeles, in a Marine base in Santa Ana, California. And you see this prototype here in the Marine base. Even the Marines pitched in. So they used Melanex, which is a type of mylar, a metallized plastic that was 1/1000th of an inch thick, for the membrane, and it had to be cut in very precise sections, fitted together with extreme accuracy, and then inflated to the exact point at which maximum surface tension was achieved for the best optical effects without bursting. So unfortunately, the prototype then burst with a deafening explosion, and you see that here. The Marines were very sad. The group had to find another contractor, which turned out to be a company called Sheldal. Coincidentally, this is the father of Peter Sheldal, the art critic. Little known fact. They had successfully built the most well-known inflatable spherical mirror to date, which you see on the left. The first telecommunication satellites designed by NASA and launched between 1960 and 66. And on the left, you see a satellite called Pagios. But while the satellites worked through their exterior mirrored surfaces, which reflected and transmitted back radio waves as they orbited the Earth, it was so simple, they just bounced radio waves off of them. The pavilion dome, and you see an architectural plan on the right, relied on the reflective properties of the mirror's interior, and this was a kind of totally untested scheme. Sigvar Stenlund, a project engineer on both satellites, became the lead engineer for the pavilion balloon. So there's a direct connection, eventually developing a negative air pressure design so that the balloon was housed within a plywood shell And when a vacuum was created between the two layers, the balloon's air pressure caused it to inflate. The fog was another extremely difficult proposition. The energy it would take to achieve the pressure necessary to make water droplets that were small enough to not simply condense and fall right away was enormous, far greater than possible at the Expo site. So the team ultimately created a system of tiny nozzles, and you see them here, at 1/10,000th of an inch in diameter, that would spray the water droplets and break them up with the requisite pressure to create a fog. And on the right, you see there is a water pressure system. And in the middle is this Japanese artist, Fujiko Nakaya, who spearheaded the fog effort. And on the right is Billy Kluver, the engineer. A full electronic system was also devised using tapes to program sound and light effects throughout, and also transistor radio broadcasts. And on the left, you see the composer David Tudor, really amazing electronic musician, and on the right, this crazy sort of console system that is seemingly covered in some strange netting, but I'm not sure what that is. People also became effects. The pavilion produced perceiving subjects, multiple subject positions, and shifting experiences. The mirror dome was like a machine for points of view, for encounters with reflection. But these were not ordinary reflections. As I've mentioned, they were sort of almost near holographic, but fully three-dimensional inverted reflections that had never been produced at this scale. And you see an example here. It's just a very simple way of trying to understand what was happening. They hovered in space above visitors' heads, and they could be perceived fully in the round, front, sides, and back. If one circled the image, you also even got parallax and perspectival distortion. In the language of optics, these were, quote, real images, images that are produced by the actual convergence of light rays. Real images are distinguished from so-called virtual images, which we see only because of the appearance of converging rays. So this is yet another example of a wonderful photo inside. And so on the right, on the bottom, you see what we would normally consider a mirror reflection. And if you understand that light bounces off a flat surface, and it appears when you look in a mirror that the reflection is behind the surface of the mirror. But the real images in the pavilion hung in front of the mirrored surface, in the same space as the viewer. And the top image shows you how those rays are bouncing, basically in front of the reflective surface. So rather than returning a body that was vertically oriented, commensurate with our own, the pavilion images were remarkably palpable, marvelously illusionistic, but also inverted, unmoored, and uncanny. In other words, these, quote, real images were not so real after all. And each individual view was unique and irreconcilable. Each person saw a reflection in a slightly different position. This is because of a phenomenon called spherical aberration. The different parts of a spherical mirror reflect to different positions, generating many focal points, unlike a parabolic mirror, which tends to focus just on one. Quote, no two people can have exactly the same image world, as the physicist Garmeier put it. The dome was composed of, quote, an infinity of worlds. And you see some other effects here. But light did not only reflect once, of course. So because light kept bouncing around the dome, the infinity of worlds dramatically multiplied again. The pavilion generated a kind of exponentially proliferating barrage of first order and second order and third order images and so on. So, for example, walking toward the mirror itself, away from the center, you'd not only see a real image or a virtual image, but its reflection, and then its reflection in turn. Reflections of real images, of virtual images, and virtual images of real images. And on the left top, you see this kind of weird multiplication. Here is someone getting close to the mirror. And on the top right is, you actually see, it's hard to make out, but the reflection hovering above them is actually right side up because it's a reflection of a reflection. On the bottom right, you see this strange phenomena where something, if it was in the dead center of the pavilion, like they had a balloon covered with this cloth, it was on a raised platform, and if it was in the dead center, it would actually flood the entire dome with its image, which you see here. So far from any kind of stable mimesis, this dizzying mirror descended into a kind of vortex of magnification, distortion, and transience. And this is why I think accounts of the mirror dome, when there have been some, seem to be caught in an endless confusion between the real and the virtual, in the broader senses of the words. So on the one hand, a lot of people who saw it spoke of the experience as strikingly embodied, corporeal, material. But others characterized it as, quote, elusive, non-real, immaterial, virtual, imagistic, the opposite of a real environment of real objects, end quote. And one critic wrote, quote, the differences between art and life, the real and the unreal, are being utterly and finally erased. The concept of reality is no longer relevant, end quote. So this was not a conquest of the real, but a kind of escape from the real. The mirror dome was, to put it another way, a form of simulacrum, a simulation without any referent, a kind of copy without an original. And where the mirror sort of pushed illusion, tipped it over into simulation, to a kind of vertiginous loss of a stable reference, the fog, which you see here, turns an ephemeral form into a resolutely physical, material experience. The Japanese artist Nakaya, who spearheaded it, didn't want something that was ethereal. She wanted it to be tangible, to, quote, feel soft and cool to the skin, quote, a fog to walk in, to feel and smell, and to disappear in, end quote. It should also be vulnerable to atmospheric conditions, making visible the otherwise invisible dynamics of the atmosphere, a kind of negative sculpture of the environment, as the artist called it, and eliciting or bringing forth of the moisture that was already in the air. In practice, the fog was actually so thick that it could drench you. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And on the first day, the World's Fair authorities thought that the fog was smoke and called the fire department, so people came with sirens. The pavilion becomes a profound exploration of the material and the immaterial, a network of technological tools and aesthetic objects and mutating subjects, all troubling the very notion of real and representation, things and beings, subjects and objects. And like a strange mirror of that telecom satellite on the left, the pavilion interior itself was filled with a wireless broadcast network of its own. And on the right, you see a very cute Japanese girl holding one of these handsets on the bottom that you could walk around with. The pavilion reveals, I think, a fundamental anxiety about the loss of the subject position of us in the global network. It reveals a deep-seated anxiety about the loss of resemblance itself, the disappearance of tangible reality within the waves and networks of modern telecommunications. This is one last shot of the dome. But the pavilion, in my eyes, does not pose as a kind of salvation to that, a seamless global village or a utopian network of communication. But it also does not simply attempt a return to presence, to some stable real of the past, lamenting the loss of authenticity or truth. Instead, the pavilion sort of crazily plunges into illusion and phantasmagoria, into another order of reality entirely. But this dream of a reconfigured world was not to be. It was cut short by Pepsi itself. The company men were shocked by E.A.T's blowing through of budgets, and moreover by the experimental and alienating quality of the performances, sound, and light programming inside, which the scope of which was kind of beyond this talk. But let's say it was not Muzak. Suffice to say, after a month, relationships broke down between the company and the artists, and in April 1970, Pepsi ejected E.A.T from the pavilion, replacing Tudor's microtonal compositions with the sweet strains of Disney's It's a Small World. Afterward, E.A.T would continue, and its network would continue to grow for several years. But the Pepsi Pavilion remained the single largest collaboration of the group. And meanwhile, back in 1962, Bell Laboratories, which I'm sorry, I skipped over this slide, but I should go back and show you. Bell Laboratories, which is where many of these artists came from, On the bottom right is their headquarters in Murray Hill, New Jersey, that they worked in for many years. And these, on the top right is Kluver, the main engineer. On the top left is an anechoic chamber, and the bottom left is an experiment with laser, which was basically invented there. And Bell had been the site of basically, 12 Nobel Prizes, an incredible sort of place for experiment and testing in the post-war period that was really also unprecedented. It was a place in a corporate research laboratory that actually did really like pure science as well as applied science. It was a really extraordinary environment of testing and failure, which Douglas has actually written about as well, and we can talk more too. So I just want to show you this warren of hallways and corridors on the bottom right in their older facility. And I'll leap back to this. But back in 1962, Bell Labs had already moved into a new building in a new town in New Jersey, designed by Eero Saarinen, which you see here. Kluver and most of the other engineers were still based in that older facility in Murray Hill. But it was becoming clear that what had been a sort of extraordinary environment of quixotic science and testing and failure was by then leveling out, becoming a kind of flattening of those fantastic involutions of the pavilion, of that mirror dome, now leveled into a single gleaming plane, which was dubbed the biggest mirror ever. That's all that I have for you today.